Prophet of Time by Joyce Lee. Chapter 1. Kayla spun to her left and barely avoided her brother's blade. Twin swords swung up in defense as he bore down on her. The force of the clash sent tingles up her arms, and she shook her shoulders out as they backed away from each other.
"Pretty move, little one. If only you sparred as well as you danced,"
Damon said with a smirk.
"If only you danced as well as you fought."
She used the flat of her weapon to deliver a sharp smack to his side and ignored the sweat running down her temple.
"You might have been able to dodge that."
Damon feigned a wince as they circled each other.
"You live to damage my pride, don't you, little one?"
"Call me that again. I dare you,"
Kayla said. She blew a loose strand of black hair from equally dark eyes. Damon laughed.
"Or what, little one?"
Expectation gleamed in his rich brown eyes. His hair glistened with perspiration from the summer heat. It was then she felt the pull. Standing at chest level with her brother, she could feel the lines of his tunic rearranging, telling her a story of an uncertain future.
Damon shifted as he stood at attention in his parents' office. The shelves of private missives, copies of contracts, and other documents were well organized in their respective areas, leaving the center clear for a large table in which a map of the known world found a permanent resting place between the oak and a sheet of glass. Carved stone tokens embedded with scrapped gems and metals were used to denote troops of each respective island, and stood where they were stationed for the foreseeable future.
"This is your chance to prove yourself as a leader, Damon,"
his mother said.
"Celia needs the next generation of mercenaries to prove themselves capable of dispensing justice. They will pay a fair price for quality only the desolate isles can provide."
Damon was hesitant to accept the mission, but Queen Tatiana had a point. Damon couldn't deny how much he needed the experience. The other islands had their generals lead in smaller mercenary work around the world, but Cerilia's issue was large enough for him to call on a fraction of each island to donate soldiers for the job.
"I understand, Mother, but Helen and I are still having communication issues. She's supposed to be my second in command, but it's already a chore to get her to talk to me."
As Kayla came out of the sight, the tension on her hair and Damon's blade at her throat made her stiffen. She pushed his arm away, and his fingers loosened around her hair as she surveyed her surroundings. The twin training swords had been kicked to the side, and curious eyes bore into her. Mutters of oracle abounded, and she cast her eyes down. She wished she had more success with breaking that particular childhood habit, but it was futile. It had been weeks since her sight had disrupted her sparring sessions, and these newer young and impressionable recruits to the desolate Isle army had no suspicions of who she was, until now. Her head hurt, just as it commonly did after she'd had a vision. She closed her eyes, and for the millionth time wished she was never born with this cursed sight.
"How long was I gone this time?"
Kayla asked, massaging her temples.
20 seconds.
Damon said, his tone low enough for only Kayla to hear. She opened her eyes and glanced at the familiar figure as he picked up her training weapons and placed them back on the rack a few yards away. Sky turned his sea-green eyes to her as if in apology.
"Did he try to get me out of it?"
"I didn't let him. Sky might not be able to help you in a proper fight."
Kayla's good mood disappeared, and she sighed. She scuffed the packed dirt of the sparring ring with her boot and returned her fingertips to her temples as Damon continued to tower over her. Damon was a large man just shy of 20, with raven black hair cropped close to his neck. The slight bit of stubble gracing his usually clean-shaven jaw made him look more rugged than he had a right to be. The man was too playful most times to look so foreboding, but at the moment, that darkness suited him. His eyes narrowed on his soldiers, and that gave Kayla the courage to look around herself. She found that the trainees no longer met her eyes, and a few of them whispered to each other. Those watching from the front row shifted as their commander's hard gaze landed on them. Though not the most sociable, She'd receive the occasional nod or smile in greeting from those around her. She'd been normal for a couple of weeks.
Do you want to know what I saw?
Damon's gaze softened as he looked back at her.
Later.
He returned his saber to the rack of training weapons, and Skye passed by him with a nod as he made his way to Kayla. The whispers grew into a buzz in her ears. It felt as if the walls were closing in on her. Skye placed a hand on her shoulder, and her headache lessened a degree. She didn't want to seem weak by leaning into him, but the temptation and comfort he offered would have otherwise been irresistible.
Let's get you home before that migraine gets the better of you.
He turned Kayla to face the path home and let her lead the way. She was eager to make her escape and appreciated Skye's ability to anticipate her needs. Her companion's focus on her well-being was second to none. He saw what her family didn't, and he always acted in her best interest, her family and his own be damned. It was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. They didn't wait for Damon to dismiss his trainees. He would catch up to them halfway back to the DeSola compound anyway. The summer breeze mussed Skye's blonde hair, and the ripple of his light green tunic was reminiscent of shifting waves in an otherwise calm sea. Kayla relished the way the wind cooled the sweat on her brows. As a halfway point between the DeSola compound and the city of Ederick, the amphitheater served as a training area, formal meeting place, and general entertainment venue. The sandy soil retained the sun's heat, and the last hours before sunset was slow to cool the air. Kayla surveyed the dry grass and the occasional leafless tree. They were far enough from the training area that she let herself take Skye's hand in hers. The contact helped mitigate Kayla's headache.
The days seem to blend into each other, don't they, Skye?
He shrugged.
It is what it is. Routine, consistent, sometimes even peaceful.
Kayla bumped her shoulder against his arm and gave him a teasing grin.
Basically, you mean it's boring. Let's try something different.
That got a smirk out of her companion.
I hope we're talking about something a little less ambitious than leaving the compound for months.
Kayla's smile became more mischievous.
Asking for a dance doesn't seem very ambitious at all.
Skye stopped in his tracks and stared at her as if she had grown an extra head.
Kayla, you know I can't dance. I'm barely an acceptable swordsman.
She laughed.
Barely acceptable? Father will demand you practice more if that's the case. He'd insist that no barely acceptable swordsman is fit to be my companion.
He's not wrong. I'm sure when we get home, Damon will want me to run drills in the courtyard.
Or we can pair up against my dear brother and show everybody how much stronger we are together.
She reached up to cup his cheek and trailed her hand down to the charm he always wore around his neck. The clear quartz wolf stared back at her with emerald eyes that matched her companion's.
Loyalty, life, love. Your parents raised you by these ideals. Honor their legacy and remember that you can do anything you put your mind to.
Skye's smile softened as he covered her hand with his.
It's thanks to you that I have this reminder of them.
He planted a chaste but lingering kiss on her brow.
Break it up, you two!
Damon's voice carried a sharp note that made them jump away from each other. Kayla shook her head as she realized her brother was still yards away. Skye put a few inches of distance between them but still held Kayla's hand.
Your brother doesn't approve of me.
He's overprotective and disapproves of anything that has to do with me.
Kayla deepened her voice to mimic Damon.
Kayla, you're always going to be in danger. Kayla, don't leave the compound. Kayla, the last time Mother made me cook, I almost burned down the house, and you call yourself an oracle.
They both burst out laughing.
Did he genuinely forget about your warning, or was he just teasing you?
Skye asked when he'd sobered.
He was distracted.
More like lazy.
You know he's only doing what he can to protect you.
Don't remind me.
The problem with her family was that they were tough when they wanted to teach her, but they ultimately never allowed her the freedoms she craved. She could hear Damon's slowing steps. He was only a few paces behind them now, and their fun was over.
Damon wedged his way between Kayla and Sky as they continued on their way.
I think it best if you don't attend training for a while, Kayla,
he said.
I know.
Damon growled. He wished he could put an end to the stigma stamped on his sister.
They don't understand.
It's human nature to fear what we do not understand, brother. No need to be angry on my behalf. You don't get angry at a snake for biting you. You just accept it, treat it, and move on. It's not the first time, and it definitely won't be the last.
Well, I'm sick and tired of it.
Kayla raised a brow.
You are you?
Damon paused and met her gaze. As soon as the words left his lips, he knew it was the wrong thing to say.
I'm sorry, that was inconsiderate of me, but they should know better.
It's not their fault that they heed the loudest voice. Don't forget, Damon. I've been in some of those people's minds. You haven't. We might know the truth, but that doesn't change the fact that those who are unsatisfied with my answers play on people's fears.
The bitterness in her tone couldn't be suppressed this time.
That's why I need to leave.
I know what you're going to ask, and the answer is still no.
Before he could continue walking through the gate, Kayla took his arm and made him look at her.
People here are afraid of me, and I refuse to stay in the compound like some miserable pet to perform when somebody comes calling for the oracle. It's been years since I thought that was the only life for me. If you won't help me convince Father, at least I know Celia will.
Damon shook his head. He'd lost track of just how many times Kayla had asked this of him, but she no longer cared for his blessing.
Why bother asking me at all, then?
Because it would be easier if we stood as a united front. I've already spoken to Celia about it last night, and she's doing her part as we speak. I was hoping you'd put a little more pressure on him, but if you don't want to, that's fine.
Damon looked at Sky.
And you agree with this?
We're all given the right to make choices and mistakes. Whatever the case, I'll support her as she's supported me.
Damon resisted the urge to knock Sky off his feet. The bastard thought he was so noble, even though he'd abandoned Kayla once before. All that talk about choices and mistakes was something Kayla always stood by, even when it led to her own heartbreak.
I suppose that means you're willing to let her go off on her own.
Kayla and Sky exchanged glances. They were always in tune with each other and had probably discussed the subject extensively. This must have been one of the rare details they'd disagreed upon. Though Damon missed the similar bond he'd had with his companion, Helen, the fact of the matter was that they'd drifted apart long ago. Sky rubbed the side of his neck.
I've yet to discuss it with my brothers, but I know they'll be taken care of in my absence.
As much as I hate to admit it, I'll need Sky by my side. I know better than to go without somebody knowing about my condition and covering up any mishaps.
She put a hand on Sky's arm.
If they'd rather remain in contact with you, I'll understand. We can come back once or twice a week at first and see how things go from there.
As long as we agree that you're not going alone. I won't do anything to convince Father to let you leave. But I won't speak out against it either.
Kayla's attention turned toward Damon. If he didn't know better, he would have thought they'd forgotten all about him. Her crooked smile broke the tension.
I can work with that.
Wrapped in a cloak of dark green to repel the worst of the sand from her face, Celia stood atop a small hill of wild grass that tickled her ankles. The river miners below exchanged friendly slaps on the shoulders before parting ways with a mountain of a man. Soil-brown eyes lifted to meet hers, and she nodded to her father as he made his way up to where Celia stood with her companion, Alan.
What's wrong, my heart? Have there been issues with your latest agricultural experiments?
He asked, the affection in his tone matching the look in his eyes. Celia shook her head and took a deep breath. She had prepared for this altercation.
We need to talk about Kayla.
His contemplative frown lightened to the faintest of sad smiles.
Don't tell me you've received another letter from your mother. Let me guess. She's urging us to throw Kayla out to see if she can fend for herself.
Kayla's the one who can no longer tolerate staying here like some docile doe. All is quiet at home, and it's been a while since anybody has asked to approach her for her sight. People finally understand how unpredictable it is.
She glanced at her companion, who took the cue without hesitation. He moved to stand by her side, and his willingness to impart his knowledge gave Celia the support she needed.
I apologize for keeping this from you, Brandon, but I believe you and Tatiana had suspicions long ago.
Alan was one of the few who could face her father without being intimidated, and so he admitted what he had learned years before setting foot in Ederic.
She is a servant.
Brandon's eyes narrowed.
And why have you kept this from us?
His voice dropped into a deep bass that was rare and dangerous with its ferocity, and his hands remained deceptively lax as his spine snapped straight. Celia had only seen her father like this once when she'd burned her hands reaching for a book Damon had thrown in the fire. She still itched with the memory of it and her father's reaction when he'd found out about the incident.
She's a servant? And you're barely telling me this now? She's been in my heart for far too long for me to accept her leaving for some arrogant god. If you'd known something like this, I would have expected you to tell us when we made you Celia's companion.
Servants aid the gods. They share the god or goddess's essence and are shaped by their will. Such a tool will not be used and discarded rashly, and she can change the course of the world by walking the path laid out for her. You cannot deny your youngest child the chance to explore either way, can you?
Brandon growled.
You overestimate my selflessness, flame monk. I will do anything to keep my children safe and happy by my side.
He made his way past Celia and Alan and waved at the workers who passed them on their way to the mines. As if wanting to confirm that all of his children were secure, they headed home, where Kayla and Damon would be after practicing with the new recruits. After all, Kayla was his jewel to coddle and protect. Damon was his pride and joy, and Celia was his heart. He had enough love to give that their mother's absence over the past year seemed inconsequential.
Do you truly believe Kayla to be happy?
Alan asked.
I gave her a companion. She's as happy as she can be with Sky at her side. He might not be ideal, but at times he can do what we cannot.
We've equipped her with as many tools and skills as we can offer, but she must find her own path. I will be by your side, but Damon and Kayla will not be as willing to stay. I am your heir, and they are second and third children. You and Mother are expected to let them fly,
Celia said, lengthening her stride to keep up with her father. Brandon stopped in his tracks and turned to her with incredulity flashing in his eyes.
You feel as if I'm jailing you, daughter.
A gilded cage will remain a cage, Father. I accept it as my duty to family and country. But Kayla probably won't anymore. It's not fair to ask it of her, considering the years we've spent taking advantage of her sight. She has a gift to share with the world.
And what if she doesn't want to be a servant? There's no telling what the gods want with her, and no matter what I decide, she will eventually feel caged, Celia. Just as you do, apparently.
Those last words were muttered under his breath. Raking his hands through his thick graying hair, he looked at them.
Do the gods' will truly matter more than our own?
Resignation and rare desperation oozed from her father, and Celia couldn't help but reconsider. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. Alan gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and Celia met his determined dark brown eyes as he nodded at her. Upon his upper left arm was a copper band that marked him as a temple monk for the god of heat and flame, Tyne. He grazed the stylized metal with his right hand, and Celia felt a presence cloak her companion for just a second before fading.
The will of the gods is beyond mortal understanding, but we worship them because they help keep the world stable. We each have a role to play, and it is our choices and intentions that define us. There will always be obligations and duty in society, and one can either embrace or run from the inevitable.
Those words brought back Celia's resolve, and she smiled. Brandon sighed and turned his gaze to Celia.
There's no way to argue with the pair of you, is there? Fine. I will allow Kayla to explore to her heart's content, But I want messages sent to all the temples in the Isles. They must take care of her if she chooses to visit them.
He paused as if lost in thought.
Why now, monk? Why have you held off telling me until now?
Alan shrugged and brushed a few stray locks of auburn hair from his brow.
She's restless. All servants are when they're ready to learn about their obligations to the gods.
Celia could sense her father's unwillingness to burden such a thing on Kayla's slim shoulders. It was bad enough that her visions left her so defenseless.
Her companion will be with her.
Celia said, knowing that was non-negotiable.
Sky knows the consequences of failing to see her safely back to us. He would never forgive himself if he allowed Kayla to get hurt.
Brandon nodded before gathering the courage to ask the final and most important question.
Which god has claimed her?
She will aid the goddess of time, Samaya.
Celia said with a nonchalance she did not feel. Brandon swore. They all knew that no letters would be sent to the Temple of Time. The place was a death trap.